Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm quite excited about this session because I think that it's actually quite important for graduate students and even for graduate students who are at the front ends of their programs, certainly also for those who are who are further along. We decided that we would each maybe say a few words here at the beginning and then try to open things up and spend as much time as possible on questions that you may have. Another thing to say is that we both have to run off to meetings at 1:30, and so we're going to be really prompt about getting out of here on time.
1:15, I think.
1:15.
Yeah, we'll try.
Yes. So maybe the first thing that I wanted to say is, or to explain, is why I think it's really important for graduate students to think about writing recommendation letters. And one of the ways that I can express this, I think, is by talking about my own experience in going to graduate school. When I was a master's student, one of the people that I took really important courses with, language courses, was a graduate student. And he knew my work really well. He could speak very authoritatively and in a very informed way about my language preparation, which was very important for me as I was applying for graduate school, because language was going to be very important. I spent some time considering whether or not I wanted to ask a graduate student to write me a letter of recommendation for graduate school. Because wouldn't that student be, perceived as somehow inappropriate for writing, or wouldn't have the kind of prestige and notoriety that you might want in a letter writer? And I ultimately decided that this is a person who knows my work really well, and I was applying to a program of which he was a graduate. And so I decided, this is the right person. This is one of the right people to write for me. And it paid off. It turned out to have been a good decision, and I know also from talking with my faculty in my graduate program that they took that recommendation letter very seriously. And so I think it will be your experience that students, especially those who are applying for graduate study, either to master's or doctoral programs, also those who will be applying for internships and fellowships and other kinds of things, will ask you to write for them. And in many cases, you will be in a better position than virtually anybody else to write on their behalf. And I think that that you shouldn't be overly concerned about not being a prestigious faculty member, that you still have a lot to give in writing those letters of recommendation, because it is the fact that oftentimes you will know those students work better than anyone else. When a student asks for a recommendation letter, one of the first things that I do is try to decide whether or not I can even write for that student. That's based on my experience with that student, whether it's a limited experience or it's an experience that I might think the student hasn't done particularly good work with me. I'm trying to make a decision about that because I know what it means to sit on the other side and read recommendation letters. And I know what it means to read a lackluster recommendation letter, either a short one or one that's I read a recommendation letter this past year where the recommender referred to the student's work as wackadoodle. And this is the case where I would have just said no.
Yeah.
I don't have a vindictive sort of impulse towards students, even those whose work I think is wackadoodle, which I hadn't seen that for a long time. It's kind of fun to see that. But I thought, that's a very damning kind of statement. And so this recommender said, maybe I just don't understand what the student has written. If you read the writing sample and think differently, then just disregard my letter. That is not going to happen. When somebody says the student's work is wackadoodle, that's the kiss of death. And so I would much rather have a frank conversation with that student about what kind of letter I can write for them, and maybe even a frank conversation about whether I think it's a good thing for them to go on to graduate school or whatever it is that they're asking me to write for, rather than writing a letter like that.
Can I just add something there?
Yeah.
I mean, my strategy, just in case this does happen to you with someone who, maybe there's someone who didn't do very well in the class you were TAing, what I usually say is, I don't think I'm the best person to write for you. It's very hard. I mean, you've been on the other side of this, right? So, and I remember this very well, and I'm still asking people all the time to write for fellowships and other things. We're all dependent on people writing for us. But I think it's pretty painful for a student to hear, no, I don't really think I can, to just hear no. And so usually what I try to do is say, there are probably other courses in which you did better. Maybe you could explore other options. And so I think there's a way to sort of send people out the door without making them feel awful, but just to say you have strengths, and I'm sure they've come across in other classes where your professors could write better, stronger letters for you.
Can I ask, how frequently has that happened to you?
Not very. I think more typical is when a student comes to me, say an undergrad here, not a graduate student, but an undergrad who is very shy, who maybe never came to see me in office hours, didn't say much in class, but did very well in terms of the writing. And when those people ask me for a letter, usually what I say is, I would be happy to, first you need to come and talk to me during office hours. One of the pieces of advice in some of the guidelines that we gave you, I think the best document that I found was from the Derek Bach Center for Teaching and Learning at Harvard. Unfortunately, we don't have any guidelines for writing recommendations from our Center for Teaching and Learning, so I was looking elsewhere. And one of the pieces of advice that they give is that before you write a letter, you should always have a conversation with the student. When we get to the point of writing for our own graduate students, we don't need to do that because we know them so well, and I'm sure this is the case for you and your advisors. I mean, they know your work extremely well. But when you're writing for somebody who you don't know that well, I think it's really important to have them come in and just say, okay, so what is it that I'm writing for? Is this a graduate program, which is one kind of letter? Is it you want to do Teach for America, which is a different kind of letter? And just try to find out more about the student, because otherwise, I think I don't know how many of you have maybe already written letters, but these are really hard to do. And if you don't know the student, there isn't much you can say. I mean, it could be a one-line letter, this person got an A in my course, but actually I know very little about what the student's interests are. And in those cases, I don't say no. I have them come in and try to find out more about them so I can write a better letter.
I oftentimes ask for additional information, too. I'll ask them for their application essay. I'll
Absolutely.
ask them for, sometimes if it's a student I had in one course 2 years ago, I'll say, can you give me the paper
Yes.
back that you wrote for me? Because I think it's very important to be specific in a letter. There's damning faint praise. There's damning generality that can come through in letters. When a letter is full of platitudes, I'm usually not that impressed. Mm-hmm. And so I want to be able to be specific. I want to be able to comment on particular aspects of what the student is applying for in relation to that student. And this just takes more information sometimes. So having the conversation, even asking for written materials. This is not out of bounds for you to want to see more from the student.
Yeah, no, in fact, usually what I do is I ask for a copy of their CV. I ask for information about what they're applying for. So if it's an academic job, let me see what the language of the job ad is, because this can really make a difference. But if it's Teach for America, just, a brief description of what this is, or, they want an internship at a publishing company. So information about what they're applying for, their CV, copies of papers that they've written for me if they have them. I do a lot of electronic grading now. I have people send me papers and I put comments on them and send them back. And so a lot of times I don't even need to ask because I already have a copy. But it can also be helpful, and this probably isn't the stage that you're in yet, but when you teach multiple classes over multiple years and somebody says, I want a recommendation, and I'm thinking, okay, I know they took such and such a course, but I can't remember whether it was 2001, 2003, and so I often ask them also to tell me what classes they took and when. Because to get on the registrar's site now, you need to know what quarter in order to check a grade. So when I'm thinking, okay, I had Jeff in class. When was that? And I could spend 15 minutes going through on the registrar's site trying to figure out what year. And so as much information as you can get is a good thing, and it might be that some of it you don't use, but a lot of times just seeing the comments that I put on a paper will just trigger a whole lot of memories. Usually people, unfortunately, do not ask you to write immediately after they've taken the class with you. They come back a year later or 2 years later, which is fine. I mean, but you might be thinking, okay, so I have very good impressions of the student, but I don't remember what they wrote their final paper on, or I don't remember what kind of comments I put. And so if you do have, if they can give you back copies of their papers, it can just trigger your memories of the student.
I think another thing that is important to consider is what gets included and what gets left out. And here too, I can speak from experience on the other side of the process, reading letters. Recommendation letters aren't always honest. And I think it's actually quite important that you're honest in a letter. And part of the way that, one of the ways that I can justify this to myself is that we trade in our integrity. That's what our recommendation letter is based on. It's based on the integrity of the writer. And in certain cases, the people reading these letters won't know you. And so they'll just kind of have to take your word for it. But in other cases, you're going to be writing recommendations, and the people reading them will be people who know you. Or you'll be writing over and over again to the same people. And so we learn to read people's recommendation letters. And so you know how to read in between the lines on these things. And every once in a while, you might get burned. I can think of an example where there were letters that were just glowing, and it turned out that there were lacunae in those letters. And I learned after the fact that they were intentional. And you can guess what I think of those letter writers. They not only damage, there isn't only damage for the student who wasn't accurately described, but there's damage all along the way in the future for future letters. And so it's really important, I think, that you're honest, and that means thinking very carefully about how to express both the strengths and the weaknesses of a student. And I think there are ways of doing this that don't undermine the student significantly who's being recommended. But it's something to, I think, really pay attention to. And I guess another way that I can justify this is that what I think a recommendation letter is for is this is a recommendation that whoever's making the decision on the other end about admitting someone to graduate school or hiring them, the recommendation letter is a recommendation for them to consider the student. I try not to oversell. I recommend that they seriously consider this student. Not, you should definitely admit this student. Because I don't know all of the factors that will weigh into the fit of that student who's applying. And so I want to respect the fact that my letter is not going to be determinative, and it shouldn't be determinative for those on the other side who are making the decision about that student. So I try to be very careful about overselling, knowing that I will almost certainly write letters to the same people in the future, but also because I think that the recommendation, while important, is only one piece of a much larger application packet. And I actually think it's not the most important part. I tend to talk to students, for example, who are coming to and asking me about, advice for making applications to graduate school or elsewhere. I talk to them about the mediated versus the unmediated parts of an application. And I tell them that recommendation letters fall within the mediated category. And the unmediated category is much more important. When I'm reading an application, I want to see the writing sample. I want to see the personal statement, because those are coming directly from the student, as opposed to the mediated parts, the grades, the recommendation letters, etc. Which there are others involved, and it can create kind of a fuzzy interaction along the way. So.
Just to add to that, I think sometimes students will approach you as if, their future is in your hands. But you can't turn a weak student into a great student with a letter of recommendation. And that's going to be obvious to, let's say they're interviewing and you've written this glowing letter and they're sitting in front of the student thinking that this person can't speak a coherent sentence. It's usually not that bad, but don't think that somehow it's your responsibility to kind of cover up somebody's issues. I think there are ways to signal things without, being, really sinking somebody. And I do think that when you're on the student side of things, you tend to think that, recommendations are going to be what get you certain things. But when you're when you eventually get to the other side, and you're a professor and you realize that you spend a lot more time reading, for example, on job searches here, the person's statement of research than any letters of recommendation. We don't even ask in our job searches for letters of recommendation until we cut down up to a short list. Because what we're really interested in is the person's work, how the person presents his or her research. So I just want to second the comment about this is your integrity, and you really need to be able to write honest letters. And if there's really a student that you feel like you can't do that for, then that's when you say no. Because you don't want to get yourself into a position where you're either writing a negative letter or where you feel as if you're trying to cover something up. And it does come back to you. There are certain people in my field whose letters, frankly, I just don't respect that much, because they always say everybody is outstanding, and you think everybody can't be this outstanding. So you have to think of this as a sort of long-term thing, that you're creating a reputation for being trustworthy in your recommendations.
I had a question two questions on this. I guess, would you say that, so this has been my impression for a while, and let me know if you agree with it. What's much more important than say, oh, this person is great, is actually saying under something substantive about their work.
Absolutely.
That's a good letter of recommendation.
Absolutely.
Or I don't mean good in terms of like good as a form, but like when you see a letter that says, I'm going to tell you something about what this person is doing and the work that they've done in detail, and it's interesting, that seems like much more of an actual recommendation.
No, I think that's right. It's not unlike your paper writing. You make claims and then you offer evidence, right? And the evidence is very important.
The other question I had just coming up with a big question about like weaknesses. is there a case where you experience something where actually you do have a student who you want to recommend, but they do have certain weaknesses, and you still think that this would actually be a good idea for this person to apply and so on, and that is there a way of actually talking about what those weaknesses or limitations are explicitly that's actually constructive for the student anyway? I mean, in a letter itself, like, this person's had these problems in the past, they've dealt with them in these ways, it's sort of interesting or admirable or something, I don't know.
Yeah, I think so.
I think, for example, you could say, let's say this is for an undergraduate student. This student came from a high school that was not as challenging and struggled in the beginning and has really grown remarkably and is doing excellent work now after a rocky start. This is part of what's helpful about seeing a transcript, because this does happen with undergrads in particular, where the first year is just a little bit, and you might want to say something about that or explain what that's about so that you can acknowledge that, yes, there was a problem, but no, it's not there anymore.
I think it's also helpful for me when I see a letter that says the student had, these issues, or was a bit of a late bloomer, came to their topic late or became serious a little later in the game. But what I see consistently is improvement. The student hasn't, run up against a ceiling. So I've had this student in 3 courses, and they were better in the third one than the second one, and better in the second one than the first one. That to me is an important. That's an important observation when I'm reading a letter that addresses these kind of potential issues. When we're reading letters, say in the Bible area, when we're admitting students, this kind of thing has come up, and we're very favorably disposed to it.
So, on your first question, you definitely want to be as detailed as possible in terms of, being specific, and that is one of the advice that they offer, that the Derek Bach Center offers for their guidelines, that your letter can only be effective if it contains substantive information about the student's qualifications. This is part of why you want to have a conversation, you want to look at old papers, what you want to do is not make it sound as if you've written a letter for anybody. The letter should not sound generic. The letter should sound as if this is a real person you're talking about, with particular strengths that you want to bring out. And you can only do that if you really spend some time thinking about it. So, one of the, so we've given you a bunch of articles. One of them was about gender bias in letters, and one of the findings, we were talking about this earlier, that I find fascinating is that there are studies that suggest that gender bias tends to especially creep in when you're writing in a hurry, because you're trying to get it done and you kind of fall back on these gendered assumptions without thinking about them. And so, another just very basic piece of advice is you want to give yourself enough time to do this well. And ideally, to write it and then put it aside and come back to it the next day and just make sure that you've said what you want to say. Because these things, they can carry implicit messages sometimes that you don't want them to. So part of the reason that we included that article is that we want people to really be aware of their language when they're writing about female candidates. Unfortunately, there don't seem to be any articles about academic letters of recommendation for racial minorities, but I think the same issue is there.
This is a really small question, but one of the issues in this paper was how you refer to the person you're writing a letter for. Like, what do you call them, Mr. or Mrs. Miss So-and-so, or the first name, or?
I think it can work in more than one way. I think there is the possibility of a gender bias that creeps in relation to this issue. and it may not even be one that's intended on your part, but it can be perceived on the other side. So my tendency, because of that, is to be more formal rather than less, and I think I can make up for perhaps the perception that I'm not as familiar with the student because I'm using this formal language, calling them, Mr. So-and-so, Ms. So-and-so, by being specific. I can show that I really know the student and work closely with them. But by maintaining that formal language, the formal title, I can also avoid the perception that especially say a woman student I might be writing for is somehow less respected by using her first name. So I tend to use Mr. and Ms. In order to avoid that, and then whatever distance that might create, I try to make up for the specificity.
Mm-hmm. I used to do all first names, and I don't anymore, and it's because of reading this kind of stuff. When I first started, it was, Jeff is applying for so-and-so, and I do last names now, and I don't even do the Mr. and Ms. It's like I'm writing a book review. Davis is so-and-so. That's been my way of dealing with things. Because I feel that that's probably the way people are talking about candidates anyway. Whether it's for a job or they're not going to say, well, should we hire Jeff or Catherine? They're going to say, probably by last names.
Yeah.
So,
I can remember, many admissions meetings when we discussed your applications.
Yeah.
And you were all last names.
Yeah. Well, it's much easier to tell you apart that way, right? Because there could be numerous of your first names. So, I think that some of the examples in the Color of Glass article of bad letters, I think, are almost as useful as, I don't know how many people got to look at the readings, but we have these sample letters of recommendation where I think they're all fairly positive, ranging from very positive to still supportive, where some of the letters that are quoted from in that Color of Glass article are really quite bad. And I think sometimes it helps you to see what's bad to keep you from replicating it. Personal comments are always, just not appropriate. Personal comments in terms of, I enjoy playing tennis with her, or somebody said in one of those letters, right, so-and-so is friends with my wife. Well, why is that relevant? And
say babysit my kids.
Yeah, these kinds of things are always inappropriate. And I can give you one example that happened probably 10 years ago that was absolutely horrifying. Where in History of Christianity we had a letter of recommendation for a woman, and the recommender, who was a woman, actually said in the letter, she has settled down a lot since she got married. Yeah. A comment like that is always inappropriate. And you just have to wonder what someone was thinking, right? But these kinds of things do appear. Now, those are actually, right, those are easy to flag. We were all appalled, like, can you believe? I think where it's more difficult is, and I don't know how many people read the Color of Glass article, is where it's more subtle and where women are always described in terms of their teaching and men are described in terms of their research, or men get more superlatives than women do, or the other thing they found in the study is that letters for men tend to be longer than letters for women. And so these are all things, if you haven't read this article, I hope you will read it, because this has made me go back and really kind of, scour my letters for these kinds of things. The tricky stuff is that one of the biases that creeps in is that often women are described in what they call the grindstone adjectives, hardworking. For me, that's a compliment for anybody. Right. So I now am sort of, just very attuned to, if I say that, I also need to use a different kind of word too. But, my own experience is that I like it when somebody says, because if somebody's coming to graduate school or coming to be a colleague, I want them to be a hard worker. But if that's all that you say.
Yeah, or descriptors of personality, for example. If somebody is congenial and easy to work with, that actually matters a lot to me, because say if we're looking at PhD applications, I'm thinking I'm going to spend the next 6 or 7 years of my life. I'm a little more optimistic. But that's important to me. It's the reason that I always say yes when somebody asks if they can come meet with me, a prospective student, because part of that process is the 15 minutes of armchair psychology that I'm doing with that student. I'm thinking about, there are some people that, I guess, I try to be a nice person, but there are some people that I know this is going to be a lot harder to work with, this person. And if people who have worked with a person closely and know them well can say, this is a person that I can connect with, those things, they do matter. And figuring out how to communicate that well without moving into an area of gender bias or just doing it in a way that's appropriate as opposed to inappropriate. I think it's very important.
Yeah. No, I think that's crucial. Now, you don't want to say that about anyone when it's not true. That they're easy to get along with. But usually in my closing paragraph, I'll make some comment, if that is the case. If it's for an academic job, I might say something like, this person will be a really good citizen, will be a good colleague, will become indispensable to your institution, this kind of stuff, where it's clear that what I'm saying is this person is really someone who you're going to enjoy having in the building. But other kinds of personal things about, marital status or those kinds of things you don't want to bring up. We were talking earlier about how to handle things like how to write about sensitive topics, and I think this is really something that it's best to consult with the student you're writing for about. So this has happened to me over the course of my career where I might have a student, let's say a graduate student who had a medical crisis and had to take a leave for a year. It's going to be very obvious that something happened, right, on the transcript. And usually in those cases, I'll say to somebody, okay, how should we handle this? What are you comfortable with me saying? For those of you who read the Color of Class article, there's a terrible example here where someone actually gave specifics of the diagnosis, kind of like too much information, and I would never do that. But there might be a case where you need to explain why there's a big hole, and where first you need to check with the student, I think, because this really is about privacy and what they're comfortable with, but to be able to say so-and-so had a medical issue and needed to take a leave, he or she is now fully recovered, but just so that you're explaining what that's about.
I think it's also a good idea to advise the student to address it.
Yeah.
So that there's a certain consistency in the application as a whole. If the student addresses that within the context of the personal statement, and then it's also seen in a letter of recommendation in a statement like this, this is not affecting them.
Right.
I think that can be an effective way of dealing with that. But I think another sort of sensitive issue that we talked a little bit about is I've read recommendation letters that say this student had a lot of catching up to do, or maybe even this student has a learning disability and has to spend 4 times as much time as other students, but is highly industrious and does that work. And it can be presented in a very positive way, even to say this student is somebody who has really excelled. But that can have a negative effect because, say, if a student had a recommendation letter like that and we're applying here, I would say, nobody has 4 times as much time as the regular student. And so that's
You
just
didn't
an
have enough
impossibility.
time.
Right. If a normal student is spending 70 hours a week studying,
And still not getting it done.
no one has 280 hours in a week. And so I think thinking through what the potential implications of a statement are is important. I mean, something that Catherine said is, it may be that that's an intentional statement on the part of the recommender, and that may be the case. So I think thinking through what you're trying to say, what the force of your statement is, and how you communicate that, especially around some of these more sensitive issues, is extremely important, because you can communicate something different than what you perhaps mean with a statement like that.
Yeah, it is something to really be careful about. And the same has to do with, I think, any discussion of race, for example, or ethnicity. Here, I think there's a distinction between somebody who is, I don't know, an undergrad who's the president of the Black Studies Association, and that's on their CV, and they're a leader in that, and you can write about that in your letter and say, this is great, this person has become a leader on campus on this. But I think for a student whose CV would not reflect that, it's probably not appropriate to say anything about that. You should know, though, that when let's say that you're writing a recommendation for graduate school, oftentimes that information is kept back from admissions committees, so actually they don't know whether. So if there isn't anything in a letter, or the student hasn't signaled it himself or herself, there's no identifying marker. And there might be some cases where a student wants you to somehow, make this public, but that's really something that should be up to them and not you.
Yeah. Let me return to the question of honesty again, too, and especially as it relates to negative comments. So do you feel that to maintain your integrity that you need to mention negative comments? I mean, presenting the candidate warts and all, or are there other ways that you differentiate the eagerness of your recommendation?
I think this. There are probably ways of doing each of these. There are ways of indicating enthusiasm through the use of adjectives and adverbs, right? But I think I try to be honest about also the growth areas that students have, and I've written letters for students and written these kinds of things in them, and they've been successfully admitted to programs.
Is that kind of a standard part of your form?
So it is. I try to think through what the particular strengths of the student are, what their weaknesses or growth areas are, and I think for people who are reading these letters regularly, there are probably some for whom anything less than glowing praise is a negative feature for that student. I tend to think, I have no data for this, I tend to think that they're in the minority. That when we are sober about our own students and the people that we think even very highly of, we know that they have strengths and weaknesses. They have areas that they still need to develop and grow into. And so I think if I can say this student has done a lot of work, if I take, say, a student of mine who's applying to doctoral work, if I were to say this student has done a lot of work on languages and on source criticism, but doesn't, have as much experience with archaeology, I know that, in this program that they're applying to, Archaeology is a major component, and I know that they'll be well served by your program in developing these skills in these areas. I think that's an honest way of addressing the student's strengths and weaknesses, and also indicating, I might even be able to say I've talked to the students specifically about this and they're enthusiastic about really developing in that area. I think that's a way of being honest without sinking the student in the letter. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There's also the think praise strategy, which is, where you haven't said anything negative, but you've been honest, and you'll say, this student got a B+ in my class and wrote a good paper on such and such. And so, you're basically telling the truth. The person reading the letter is going to say, okay, this is a solid person, but not a star. And that's probably what you're saying, right? But in some cases, you really, if the person is not a star, right, then that's what you do. Yeah.
It's also the case that some people will rank a student, in a letter. They'll say this person is within the top 25% of students that I taught. And sometimes, these letters of recommendation will come with a form from the school that you have to fill out too. And on those, sometimes it'll say, rank this student, top 2%, top 10%, And I oftentimes, rankle at this too, because I think, who keeps track?
Yeah. But also, the top 2% at University of Chicago is not the same as the top 2% somewhere else.
Exactly.
So it just seems like I hate those. Actually.
Well, and this is actually an important point too, that, when somebody says, this is the best student that I've taught in 30 years, and then there are other parts of the application that are uneven, I'm forced to conclude that person has never taught a good student in their life. And so, this too, it reflects on your integrity. And when I'm reading applications, I am looking for consistency across the application. Or if the recommendation reflects a certain, growth area, I expect to see that elsewhere in the application. And if I do, that's unproblematic. But I have read letters, and people sometimes feel obliged to say these sorts of things. This is the best student that I've taught in 30 years. And then I look at the writing sample, and it's a problem. That's a big problem for that letter writer.
Yeah, but you can also, there's a funny example in one of these where I thought it was funny. It was something like, this is among the best students I taught in my 5 years. And I thought, well, that isn't really actually saying that much. I think you hold those for the ones where you really mean it. So I wrote a letter for someone, this is for a colleague at another university who was applying for a job. And I described her as brilliant. And I said, and it was true, this is only the second time I have ever used this word in a letter of recommendation in 15 years. And I really, really mean it. This person is off the charts. And so, this is the kind of thing where you save those because I think it gives you a whole lot more credibility if you're not saying everybody's brilliant, but if you really save it for the people who... those are the people who are so easy to write for, frankly. I think where everybody struggles is with the student who's kind of a solid student, who's good, and then what you really want to do is you want to find, what are the strengths that I can pull out? What is it that this person really does well? And it could be that, a student has a weakness and they come to you and they say, I want this job, and you think, well, you know what? In her job, it really doesn't matter that she or he is not good at this thing. And you might feel like it's not something that has to be mentioned. So this is part of why it's important to know what you're writing for, because there are different positions that. So I had a wonderful student, an undergraduate in the sciences, who really could have come here to do a PhD. She was just a wonderful student. And I really had to think hard about, okay, she's going into a scientific research career. So what is it that I want to say about her that doesn't make her sound like she should be in divinity school? So you have to think a little bit about who your audience is and what kinds of skill sets they're looking for, and then to think about how does the student match up there or not. And there are times where, especially when it's graduate school, where you might have to do some, kind of honest talking about, this might not be the best thing, or are you sure about this? I've never said no to anybody saying, I want to go forward, but I would say, okay, this is really hard, and here's your record, and this is going to be difficult for you to get into top schools, and let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, I think this is actually quite important that you all know and are facing an uncertain job market. I think Catherine may feel differently about this than I do, but I don't think there's virtually any reason for anyone ever to go to a second-tier graduate program. And if somebody wants to do that, I really want to talk to them about why they want to do that. Because if they think, I just need to go to graduate school and get the degree and then I'm going to go get a job, and sometimes students think this, then I feel a certain responsibility to tell them if they're soliciting a letter from me, what I think that means for them. And I can imagine ways in which they could have a cogent argument for why that would be a good thing for them. But if their plan is to go on the open job market and try to get a job afterwards, I try to dissuade them. I oftentimes say, is there anything else that you could possibly do and be happy in your life? Because you're not going to make any money doing this, it's going to be hard to find a job. Graduate school is not easy. I sometimes joke and say, look, your friends are going to be getting real jobs and buying real furniture and eating in real restaurants, and you're going to be a student, and your family is going to say, are you still in school? You guys probably get these questions sometimes. I get these questions. The person has to do it because they love it, and I think they have to have a realistic idea about what it means to do this. There's something very romantic about being a graduate student, and
you all feel it, right? Yeah. Until you actually arrive.
Until you actually arrive and do this, it becomes much more real. And so I want to help them understand, to some extent, what it means to actually be a graduate student, what ramen noodles actually are.
And how many different ways you can prepare them.
I think all of this falls within the larger gambit, though, of recommendation writing. I want to make sure that I'm doing that person a service, and that they're really going in with their eyes open. And you all have, I think, here too, as graduate students, you have a unique perspective. I remember graduate school very fondly. That's probably something that has grown over time. And so, it's very important that these students understand that, in many cases, they will think very highly of you, they will look up to you, and they like that you're in a position of power, and they want to be in that position. It's important for them to have a realistic perspective on what they're planning to embark on, and what it means to get a job on the other side, and what it means to do this work, and what it means for their wallet, and family choices, and all kinds of things.
I I wanted to look at some of these actual letters with you. So in the Color of Glass article on page 199, they give you an example of what they call a letter of minimal assurance. And I don't know who has it. I can read it. This is how short it is. This is what you do not want to write. So this was a study of letters for medical schools, and this is what this one says. It gives me great pleasure in writing this recommendation letter for Dr. Sarah Gray. I have known Sarah, notice the first name, I have known Sarah as a resident and as staff at, I don't even know how to say that, Metropolitan Hospital. She is knowledgeable, pleasant, and easy to get along with. I have no hesitation in recommending her for a faculty position. I will be happy to answer any further questions in this regard. This is a letter that says nothing, and the only adjectives are knowledgeable, pleasant, and easy to get along with. This is not a letter that would really impress anybody. They then gave a second example of this, which is somewhat better. It says she's a superb clinician and academician, but they pointed out that she's not described as an agent in this letter. It's more the writer's relationship to her. And I think this is something to be aware of, too, that when you're writing, you do want to present the person as a person in his or her own right, and not just that person's relationship to you. Because this is someone who needs to go and sort of stand on his or her own feet somewhere. And so just being aware of, attributing agency to the people that you're writing for, I think that's
This is where I think giving that evidence is really important.
Yeah.
Right? This person is a superb academician.
What does that mean?
For example.
Yeah, for example.
This person wrote this very important article. She argues such and such. This is a major contribution to the field because, doing the examples, doing the because, giving the rationale is very important.
I'm trying to figure out, it advise me, how to balance something like promise or potential against more tangible qualifications. I have a student in the class that I was just a TA for who strikes me as extremely promising. I think her skills of observation are unusual for an undergrad. But, she isn't particularly well trained, and, she's thinking of grad school, and I'm trying to figure out, I think she has the potential, the intellectual skills that would enable her to get the technical skills more quickly than, say, people who might have the technical skills but less the intellectual gymnastics. Are there ways to convey that, positively while acknowledging the lack of preparation and sort of, balancing those things?
I think so. If I were in your position, I think I would say so-and-so is still learning some basic technical skills, but she's smart. And you could then go on to give an example, So and especially if it's a case where I love reading recommendation letters from someone who says they're really eager to learn. Mm-hmm. And if that's true of this person, to be able to say, she came without the educational background of some other students or the training, and she's still picking up the skills that she needs, but this is a very smart, motivated person who's eager to learn, who is absorbing things and making great strides and has great potential. That's a pretty exciting letter to read on the other side, where you're thinking, okay, so a place like this could be just revelatory for that person.
She makes the connections more quickly than the students who are more advanced. Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right.
I think if you can talk about that, you might even say, the student also knows that she needs to work on languages and she's actively, working on them. I think this is a case where not only do you want to reflect this in a letter, but I think also advise the students about what they can do to improve their record and their training, so that if the student wants to work on whatever and doesn't have that language yet, they need to be advised in that way. And you can even say that they have them and the student is doing that.
Yeah, that for me is an easier letter to write than the kind of middle of the road person who doesn't seem all that engaged and, who is just taking the class because they need a distribution requirement and then they want a letter, and you sort of feel like, okay, there's nothing bad to say necessarily, but you can't make the kinds of claims that you want to make about this person, which is that they're really on an upward trajectory.
Yeah, I guess I had an especially hard time writing for the B+ student. That student who even shows real dedication to the field, the student who is good, not great. Because I think increasingly it takes more than that, say, if we're talking about graduate school.
But again, it depends on what it does depend on what you're recommending somebody for. So if you're recommending somebody for seminary, your letter is probably going to be more focused on this person has a very strong sense of vocation. This person is a very effective communicator, gave an excellent presentation in class. I think you're thinking about what is the skill set that's demanded in this job, or if it's a museum job. I wrote for someone once where the person had done a really great BA, and so I could emphasize, okay, this person is really a great researcher. She knows how to find things in the archives, and this is a perfect fit for the kind of work she would be doing for you.
I wrote recently for somebody for one of the Chicago City colleges. And there, I wasn't going to emphasize the arcane details of her research. I was going to emphasize her real skills in teaching in the classroom and the diverse populations that she had taught. These kinds of things, because it was the right thing to emphasize in that case.
And in fact, they might even get a little bit scared if the whole letter was about, this person is a great researcher who spends all of her time with these texts. They're like, no, we don't want that. So this is why it's important just, so you guys are writing the recommendations, but you're also being recommended for things. And one piece of advice, if you do have any faculty members who don't ask you for the things that I just laid out that you should ask for, you should give them to them. In other words, if you want to be recommended for a job, send the job description so that they know what they're recommending you for. Because it can make a difference. And all of you are probably going to be applying for multiple kinds of things. So when I was going on the job market, I was applying for jobs in American religious history, but also women's history. And so I hope anyway that my recommenders were aware of that and trying to tailor letters to the different constituencies, because otherwise somebody would be like, American religious history? This is not an American religious history job. Why would we want to hire that person? So it is important for you to give as much information in the same way that you need to get that information back from the students you're recommending.
This is sort of a very technical question, but if you're writing for, let's say, 8 students asking for a letter, and they are all sort of solid students if you display them, but in a slightly different way, 2 are somewhat better than 6, but it's not to the extent of one person got an A in my class and the other person got a B class. But they sort of all got the same grade, but you see this different potential. What would be some of the sort of ways to kind of address that in your world? Like, those are kind of slight hints to point out that one person is stronger than another person, especially if all these people apply to the same grad school.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen to you too often at this point. So actually that's almost an ideal scenario where you've got basically a template for a letter that then you're individualizing according to, personal characteristics. But I think where it gets tricky is if you are recommending multiple people for a single position. And I think other than, people like us, I don't think that happens very often. I mean, it's probably unlikely that you would be recommending, for example, 2 people for the same internship downtown or something. When it comes to graduate school, then it does get tricky. If there are 3 people who all want to apply, say, here, and they all want letters from you, I think you just have to be as honest as possible about their individual strengths. And it's really up to you whether you want to rank or not. I usually try not to because it's uncomfortable, because if I'm writing a letter for somebody, it means that I really feel strongly. I have occasionally said, let's say that I know that there are 3 people applying for the same job. I might say, I think so-and-so is a better fit for this job for these reasons. But if you're interested in somebody who has these strengths, you should definitely look at this person too.
I think this is actually very important. It's important not only for you as a recommender, but also you as a reader of job descriptions. Job descriptions are political documents, and they don't always accurately reflect what is actually being sought. And so it's very important to take them seriously and to recognize, the limits of their utility. So that if somebody, like in the example that Catherine just gave, the person who falls under, but if you're looking for, may indeed be a very important candidate for that job. Because it may be that the dean's office wants the job description to read this way, and that's the way it reads. But the department really wants something else, and they're going to be the ones making the recommendation for who to hire. So I think you can certainly say precisely what Catherine says. That is, you can say, I think this person is a better fit for the job. But you can also recognize that you only have part of the information, right? That there may be more there that you're not privy to. And this is where I guess what I said earlier about what I feel like what I'm doing as a recommender is recommending consideration of this candidate. And I think that when we realize that a job description is sometimes incomplete, sometimes even inaccurate, that we can more readily make recommendations like what Catherine says, that but if you're interested in somebody who does such and such, sometimes during the process of a job search, interests change as well. You can start out thinking you're looking for X and end up looking for Y. And
there are also, though, some real stretches. I mean, there have been times where I have advised someone, no, really, you don't fit this job at all.
Right.
I mean, it's just not in your disciplinary training. I think this is, it's very difficult right now because the job market is so hard, and so people want to apply for anything. But I'm about to go to the ASR search committee, and we had a letter from a very distinguished scholar for that position, and their field has nothing to do with anthropology or sociology of religion. And I mean, it's so far afield that it's sort of like, what is this even doing here? And so usually if someone asks me to write a letter like that, I just talk to them about, well, how do you think you would fit? And you might have to do that with students too, where, they say, well, I really want to do X, I want to go to medical school, and you might have to say, well, I'd be happy to write for you for medical school, but you haven't taken any courses, that you would require. And so you should go talk to your college advisor, because it doesn't look to me as if you have the profile right now, or even if I write you a great letter, where you could get into medical school because you need to have X number of courses in the sciences. Those kinds of things can happen where it shouldn't happen. I mean, people should not fall through the cracks that way. Because sometimes people are shy and they don't go talk to their college advisors, or they really don't, understand that they can't get into law school if they, haven't done these kinds of courses. And if you're teaching undergrads, you should know that on the grading form, and your professor can get this for you if you don't have access to it yourself, it always lists the college advisor. And so if you have particular concerns or questions about a student, or you think, okay, this person I just said to them, I don't think that you have the courses you need for medical school, or maybe I don't know if they do. That's when you can pick up the phone and say, so-and-so just came to my office and wants me to write a letter, and I'm just not sure that the person has the courses. Do you know? So you can try to help that way too.
Do you have like a cutoff? Thank you very much. Do you have like a cutoff time in terms of for how far ahead can the student ask for your? Because if someone emails you and says, I need this in 48 hours, would you say that that's my policy, give me 3 days? Or
this is very individualized for me. So, once I've written a letter for somebody, if there's something that comes up in a hurry, I can usually tailor it pretty quickly. If it's a student I don't know very well and it's like, I need the letter tomorrow, that's a different story. I think you have to figure out what your own boundaries are on that. But I usually ask for people to give me, a month is a good amount of time. You should expect these things to take a while to write. I don't know, what one of these is like for you, but it can easily take 2 hours to write one of these things. They're hard. Because you don't want to write the generic letter, so-and-so got a B in my class, and it does require some thinking, and this is even beyond, this is just the writing, this is not sitting down with somebody and saying, tell me about why you want to teach for America, so that I can say something about that in my letter.
Yeah, I usually, unless it's one of these situations where I know the person well and I've written for them before and say they're my advisee, I usually ask for at least 2 weeks, and I think a month is perfectly reasonable. And it's usually the case that if it's somebody that I really want to go to bat for, I'll write the letter at 1 a.m. Yeah, I like to sleep.
And so do you.
And so I don't feel badly if it's going to mean writing at 1 a.m. for somebody I had in one class 2 years ago, saying, I just don't have enough time.
Yeah, but it takes time. And so, it's something that we all do for free. It's very generous. You're going to do a lot of these. But in some ways, you're just giving it back. People have written for you. People will continue to write for you. You'll be writing for other people. And so whenever I feel burdened by it, I always think, okay, people have done me such great favors by doing this. And so, this is something to really take seriously. You want to do this well. And that's, I think, why we started off with don't write letters for people that you're like, I have not a single good thing to say. And usually they won't ask you because the feeling will be mutual.
But it's also the case that your letters as graduate students will make a huge difference. They'll have a real impact.
Yeah.
I think you should take it seriously because your letters will have such an impact.
And a lot of times you know the students better than the professor who's teaching the class. If you're a TA, sometimes you're doing freestanding courses, but if you're the TA, you might have spent more time talking with the student. You might know the student better, and so it really makes sense for you to write the letter. Jeff and I were talking about the advice in one of these about potentially co-signing letters, and we decided we didn't think that was a very good idea because I think it sort of dilutes, it raises questions. It dilutes the authority of the graduate student writing. It raises questions about whether the professor really knows the student. And I think it makes the graduate student look kind of like, I can't do this on my own, or, I don't have the authority. And you do. You're the teacher.
Yeah, there was once, I said to Catherine, there was once a book review of my first book that was co-authored. Never co-author a book review.
That's bizarre.
But I think it had the same sort of effect to say, it raises questions for the reader.
Who actually read it?
Yeah, who read the book? Who wrote this? How can somebody co-author an 800-word book? But this letter, these are the kinds of questions that I'm going to ask if I read a co-authored letter. And they say, who co-authored the letter?
Yeah, and who is this really from?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, oh yeah, it's wonderful.
It's about right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.